I arrived at Black Hollow under a sky that threatened rain, the cold wind biting through my jacket. The forest seemed darker than it should have been, the thick canopy blocking out what little light the fading afternoon sun provided. The towering trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. This was no ordinary forest. The locals had warned me, but I didn't listen. I never listened to those old legends, stories about things that lived in the shadows. I was here for science, to investigate the bizarre animal behavior that had been reported in this area. Strange sightings, unnatural howling, just enough to pique my curiosity. I set up camp deep in the heart of the forest, my small tent feeling insignificant against the overwhelming vastness of the woods. The air smelled damp, thick with moss and decay. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and distant caw of a crow. But it was Halloween night, and that added a strange electricity to the atmosphere. As night fell, I began documenting my surroundings, making notes on the strange behavior of animals. No birds sang, no critters scurried. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but the unease settled in my stomach like a stone. Then, just as I was about to turn in, I heard it. A howl, long, mournful, and piercing. It echoed through the trees, the kind of sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. But it wasn't the howl of any wolf. No, this was something different. Something wrong. It almost sounded human. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the tent, scanning the area. The light cut through the darkness, but the trees seemed to shift just out of reach. The wind had died, leaving the air unnaturally still. I heard the howl again, closer this time. It was accompanied by a rustling in the underbrush, something moving quickly through the woods, circling me. Fear prickled at the edges of my mind, but I pushed it down. I had to stay rational. It was probably just some animal, maybe a coyote. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Whatever was out there was bigger, more intelligent. The howling grew louder, joined by more voices. It surrounded me now, coming from all directions. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward toward the tent. The flashlight flickered and then went out. I froze. The darkness around me was absolute, suffocating. I could hear them now, footsteps, dragging and shuffling through the leaves. Close. Too close. My pulse thundered in my ears as I fumbled to relight the flashlight, but my hands were shaking too much to get a grip. Suddenly, a sharp snap of a branch right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing. Or at least nothing I could see. Then a whisper, so faint I almost didn't hear it. "Leave!" I gasped, spinning around again. I could feel it. Something was watching me, its gaze burning into my skin. I tried to step back, but my foot hit something. My heart leapt into my throat. I glanced down and saw it. Deep claw marks gouged into the ground, fresh, as if whatever made them was still close. The earth was torn apart as if something had been dragged. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the tent, my breathing ragged, my mind racing. But just as I reached for the zipper, I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, and there, in the faint glow of the moon, I saw them. Not wolves. No, these creatures stood on two legs, their eyes glowing a sickly yellow, their bodies twisted, hunched over like some grotesque mockery of man and beast. They snarled, their teeth sharp and glistening, mouths wet with saliva. They weren't just hunting me, they were playing with me. Before I could scream, the first one lunged. Its claws slashed through the air, narrowly missing my face. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, landing hard on the ground. My vision blurred as pain shot through my ankle, but I couldn't stop now. I had to move. The howling rose again, but this time it was deafening, the sound vibrating through my bones. More of them appeared, stepping out from the trees, their eyes locked on me. I scrambled to my feet, limping away as fast as I could, but they were toying with me, closing in, circling. Then, without warning, the howling stopped. Dead silence. The creatures stood motionless, their yellow eyes fixed on something behind me. I didn't dare turn around, but I didn't have to. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, and the creatures in front of me backed away, their ears flattening in fear. Whatever was behind me, it was worse than them. Far worse. I felt the ground tremble beneath me, and then a voice, deeper, guttural, inhuman, spoke from the shadows. "You're too late." The forest erupted into chaos, and everything went black. When I woke, I was lying on the cold, damp earth, my body aching from the fall. I wasn't sure how long I had been unconscious, but the night had grown darker, the moon now hidden behind thick clouds. I tried to sit up, but my head spun, and a sharp pain radiated from my ankle. As I blinked away the dizziness, the memory of what happened came flooding back. The creatures. The voice. I glanced around, expecting to see those twisted figures looming over me, but the clearing was empty. The eerie silence had returned, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was lurking just beyond the tree line. I needed to move, but every inch of my body screamed in protest. My ankle was swollen, the pain unbearable. I forced myself to stand, leaning heavily on a nearby tree. The flashlight was gone, probably lost in the chaos of my desperate escape. I fumbled for my phone, praying it still had some battery left. The screen flickered to life, but the signal was non-existent. Typical. The tent was just a few yards away, torn and collapsed. Whatever had attacked me must have trampled through it after I blacked out. I limped over, searching for anything I could use. My bag was still there, though it had been tossed aside and half its contents spilled onto the ground. I grabbed what I could, my water bottle, a knife I'd brought along for protection, though now it seemed laughably inadequate, and the spare flashlight. As I clicked it on, the weak beam cut through the dense shadows, revealing something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt, just a few feet from where I had fallen, were footprints. But they weren't the twisted, clawed marks from before. These were human. Bare feet, larger than any man I had ever seen, pressed deep into the earth, leading away from the clearing and into the heart of Black Hollow. The tracks were fresh, still damp with the moisture from the soil. Someone or something had been here while I was unconscious. I took a step back, my heart pounding. Every instinct screamed for me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But there was nowhere to go. I was miles from the nearest road, and even if I could make it that far on my injured ankle, I had no way of knowing which direction was safe. The creatures were still out there, and something else was too. The deep, guttural voice from before echoed in my mind. "You're too late. Too late for what?" I didn't have time to dwell on it. A low, rumbling growl drifted through the trees and my body tensed. It wasn't the same howl from earlier, this was different. It was closer. I turned toward the sound, sweeping the flashlight through the woods. The trees cast long, twisted shadows, and for a moment, everything seemed still. But then I saw it. Just at the edge of the beam, something moved. A figure, tall and gaunt, slipping between the trees, watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't one of the creatures. This figure stood upright, its posture impossibly rigid, its limbs too long, too thin. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment the figure disappeared. I frantically slapped the side of the light, trying to steady it. When the beam returned, the figure was gone. My pulse raced. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line. I could feel it, though. Whatever it was still there, watching, waiting. Then, in the distance, the howling started again. But this time it was different. The sound was deeper, more guttural. It wasn't just an animal call, it was a warning. The trees around me seemed to close in, the air thickening with every passing second. Panic surged through me as I realized I was being surrounded. The howls grew louder, echoing off the trees, bouncing back in disorienting waves. I spun in circles, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but it was everywhere. A snap of a twig to my right. I swung the flashlight in that direction and gasped. There, just at the edge of the clearing, stood one of the creatures from earlier. Its glowing yellow eyes locked onto mine, and a low growl rumbled deep in its chest. Its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing sharp, glistening teeth. Behind it, more of them emerged from the shadows, their grotesque forms moving with an unnatural speed and grace. I stumbled back, my mind racing for a plan, any plan. I couldn't outrun them, not in my condition, and there was nowhere to hide. My fingers tightened around the knife, but it felt useless in my hand. Then, without warning, the creatures froze. Their heads snapped toward the trees, ears flattening in terror. The howling ceased. For a moment, the world was still, and then I heard it again. The voice, deep, guttural, and impossibly close. "You shouldn't have come." The ground trembled beneath me, and from the darkness beyond the trees a figure emerged, taller, broader, and far more terrifying than the creatures that had been stalking me. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if it knew there was no escape. Its eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I realized the creatures weren't hunting me. They were running from it. Before I could react, the figure raised one impossibly long arm, pointing directly at me. And then, with a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, it spoke. "She belongs to me." The creatures scattered, vanishing into the trees, their howls fading into the distance. I stood frozen, the figure's glowing eyes burning into my soul. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something else was here, something far worse, and it was watching me. The silence after the creatures fled was worse than the howling. The oppressive quiet of the forest seemed to wrap around me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. My legs trembled beneath me, my ankle a dull throb compared to the terror pounding in my chest. The figure, the thing that had spoken, was gone, but I could still feel it. It had left its mark on the air, a lingering presence that seemed to watch from every shadow. I forced myself to move, stumbling back toward the tent, but every step felt like wading through thick, invisible mud. The flashlight flickered again, struggling to stay alive in the thick blackness. I cursed under my breath, shaking it uselessly. The last thing I needed was to be plunged into total darkness out here, not with whatever that thing was still out there. The knife in my hand felt like a toy, a ridiculous defense against something so monstrous. I gripped it tighter anyway, as if holding it could somehow ward off the dread settling in my bones. My mind raced, trying to figure out my next move. There had to be a way out of here, a way to escape Black Hollow. But with no signal and no sense of direction, I was trapped. The forest had become a maze, and I was its prey. I reached the remains of my tent, collapsing to my knees. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I leaned forward, clutching the fabric of the torn shelter, trying to steady myself. The cold night air stung my face, but I welcomed it. It reminded me that I was still alive, barely. The growls, the howling, the whispers in the dark. They felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite fit together. Why had those creatures run? What was that thing that claimed I belonged to it? And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. My breath hitched. Slowly, I turned my head, the flashlight trembling in my hand. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw it, a figure standing among the trees, half hidden in the shadows. It wasn't the twisted, monstrous shape of the creatures, nor the hulking, broad figure that had spoken before. No, this figure was small, human. I strained my eyes, trying to make out details, but the shadows clung too tightly. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I shook my head, squeezing my eyes shut. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe the stress and the pain were finally catching up to me. But when I opened my eyes again, I heard it. A soft voice, barely a whisper. "Help me!" My blood ran cold. I stood up too quickly, pain shooting through my ankle, but I ignored it. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned in slow circles, scanning the trees. The voice had sounded close, so close I could almost feel the breath on my neck. But there was nothing. No one. I took a cautious step forward, shining the beam of the flashlight through the dense foliage. The trees stretched on forever, thick and unyielding, their branches like claws reaching for me. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw her. A girl no older than 8 or 9, standing at the edge of the clearing. Her pale skin glowed faintly in the dim light, her hair hanging limp around her shoulders. She was barefoot, dressed in a thin, white nightgown that was torn and stained with dirt. Her eyes were wide, hollow, filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "Help me." I froze, my mouth dry. This couldn't be real. There was no way a child could be out here, not in these woods, not in the middle of the night. But there she was, standing so still, watching me with those empty, haunted eyes. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and get as far away from her as possible. But something kept me rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. "What are you doing out here?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The girl didn't move. For a long moment, she just stared at me. Her lips parted as if she was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Then, slowly, she lifted her arm and pointed into the darkness behind her. "Follow me," she said, her voice eerily calm. I hesitated. My mind screamed that this was a trap, that I should stay far away from her. But the way she looked at me, with those hollow eyes filled with something ancient, made me take a step forward. The girl turned and walked into the woods, her bare feet making no sound as she moved through the brush. My legs felt like lead, but I followed her, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled forward. I wasn't sure why I was following. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was something more primal, some instinct telling me that this girl, as unsettling as she was my only hope. We moved deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around us, their branches whispering in the wind. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the very atmosphere was changing the further we went. Then, without warning, the girl stopped. She stood perfectly still in front of a large oak tree, her back to me. I took a step closer, my heart hammering in my chest. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The girl didn't answer. She simply raised her arm again and pointed to the ground in front of the tree. I shone the flashlight where she pointed, and that's when I saw it. A shallow grave. The earth was disturbed, freshly dug, the dirt piled unevenly around the edges. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What is this?" I asked again, taking a step back, my legs trembling. The girl finally turned to face me, her pale face twisted into a sorrowful expression. "It's you," she whispered. "You're already dead." The world spun around me, my breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, tripping over a root, the flashlight slipping from my hand and plunging me into darkness. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what she had just said, but before I could react, the ground beneath me shifted. I fell, tumbling into the open grave, the cold earth swallowing me whole. And from the edges of the pit, I heard her voice again, soft and distant. "You've always belonged to them." I hit the bottom of the shallow grave hard. The wind knocked out of me as the cold, damp earth pressed in from all sides. My head spun, panic rising in my chest as the walls seemed to close in around me. The girl's words echoed in my mind. "You're already dead." But something didn't feel right. I wasn't dead. I could still feel my heart pounding in my chest, the sting of pain in my ankle, the cold sweat dripping down my face. I could feel everything. Desperation clawed at me and I scrambled to get up, but the loose dirt slid beneath my hands. I grabbed the edge of the grave, my fingers sinking into the soft soil, pulling myself up inch by inch. My arms trembled with the effort, but I refused to stop. I wasn't going to die here. Not like this. Finally, with one last push, I managed to pull myself out of the grave, collapsing onto the ground next to it, gasping for air. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the tangled branches of the trees above me, trying to steady my breathing. The forest was still, too still. The oppressive silence weighed heavily on me, but I knew I had to move. I forced myself to stand, wincing as pain shot through my injured ankle. The flashlight had rolled a few feet away, its beam weak and flickering, but I limped toward it, picking it up with trembling hands. The girl was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere, no movement, no sound. Just the trees and the lingering dread that hung in the air. But as I stood there, something shifted. The cold chill that had settled over the forest seemed to lift, the air warming just slightly. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on me all night began to ease, like a heavy fog slowly retreating. I shone the flashlight back toward the grave, half expecting to see something horrible rise from it. But instead, the ground was smooth, undisturbed. The grave was gone. It was as if it had never been there at all. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the surrounding trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something fundamental about the forest itself. The shadows weren't as menacing, and the trees didn't seem to close in on me like before. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it, the faintest sound of birds chirping. A sound I hadn't heard since I first entered Black Hollow. The forest was coming back to life. I limped through the trees, my steps cautious but determined. Every sound seemed more natural now, the rustling of leaves, the gentle sway of branches in the breeze. It was as though the forest had been under some terrible curse, and now it was lifting. As I moved, the darkness slowly began to fade, and through the trees I saw a faint glow of dawn breaking on the horizon. Relief washed over me. I had made it through the night. But what had happened? Who was the girl? And what did she mean when she said I belonged to them? My mind spun with questions, but as I stepped into a clearing, a new sense of peace settled over me. The air was fresh, the sky a brilliant orange and pink as the sun began to rise. It felt like a rebirth, like the horrors of the night were melting away with the morning light. Then, in the distance, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. For a moment, my heart skipped a beat. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't one of the creatures. It was a person, a man, tall and strong, with kind eyes and a concerned expression. "Are you okay?" he called out, stepping toward me. I hesitated. The events of the night still fresh in my mind, but there was something about him, something that felt safe. As he approached, I could see that he was dressed in hiking gear, a large pack slung over his shoulder. I think so," I stammered, still unsure if this was real or another trick. He offered me a hand, helping me stand. "I've been searching for you," he said. "I heard someone was out here last night. You're lucky to be alive." The weight of his words hit me, and suddenly the terror of the night came rushing back. But it was over now. I was safe. "I don't know what happened," I admitted, my voice shaking. "There was something in the woods. Creatures. A girl." The man's expression softened. Black Hollow has always had its stories. They say the forest is cursed, but no one really knows why. People come out here and some of them don't come back. I shivered, remembering the voice, the howling, the grave. "I think I saw them," I whispered. "But they're gone now. The forest feels different." The man nodded, glancing around the clearing. "Sometimes the forest tests people. It shows them their worst fears, their darkest thoughts. But if you can make it through the night..." He paused, looking at me with a strange intensity. "You're free, free." The word echoed in my mind, and for the first time since I had entered Black Hollow, I felt it. The weight of the night lifted completely, the fear dissolving in the warmth of the rising sun. As we walked toward the trail that would lead me out of the forest, I glanced back one last time. The shadows no longer seemed menacing. The forest was just a forest now, mysterious, yes, but no longer filled with terror. I took a deep breath, feeling the fresh morning air fill my lungs. I had survived. Whatever dark magic had haunted Black Hollow, I had faced it, and I had won. The howling was gone, and in its place, the peaceful sounds of the forest waking up greeted me. The nightmare was over, and as we left Black Hollow behind, I couldn't help but smile. I had escaped the darkness, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was truly free.